You're probably making indie games wrong. At least this is what I thought after my conversation with Xalavier Nelson Jr. He made I Am Your Beast, El Paso Elsewhere, Life Eater, Click Holding, An Airport for Aliens Currently Run by Dogs, Space Warlord, Oregon Trading Simulator. And after this conversation, I was sure of it. You, me, we need to make games like Xalavier. Xalavier has made a ton of games. They're really good, but the best part is he makes them fast. He actually finishes his games, and he does this with something called artificial constraints. This conversation is going to change the whole way you think about your indie game career.
Much like I talk to developers, so like, I don't know how my game took 4 years. And I look at their game design document or I chat to them, I'm like, it's very clear actually why your game took 4 years. Not to say I'm Nostradamus or anything, but in a lot of cases, it is just logic and math. You have 4 worlds described for a 3D platformer, which is a heavily iteration and polish heavy game. You're gonna make that in 6 months, buddy? 4 worlds? 6 months? What? Unless you're building a fundamentally different type of game,
Yep.
at which point that becomes possible, then there's no way that the maths. So in a similar way, publishers say, we're gonna do a different style. And you hear this from almost every publisher announcement, especially now, or every investment house that comes in. But if they have the same value set, at the end of the day, their processes will reflect their values, no matter what their stated goals are. And so what I look for when I look at partnerships now, whether it's fellow developers, even people I hire, or my publishing partners, I say, what can I see from how you run your projects and your teams and the processes you build are your actual value sets? What do you actually care about? And if it's, say, a publisher who always wins awards, and the games that get announced under their label, it's always like 3, 4, 5 years post their announcement that they finally come out. They win a lot of awards. Sometimes they make a lot of money, but it always takes 3, 4, 5 years. I know that either the publisher picks those types of games, or it will make any game that goes into its structure one of those things. And if I'm coming in as a developer who loves to make things in a year or less, 18 months or less, I'm either fundamentally incompatible with that structure, or we're going to have a really bad time being in that room together because they're going to be like, well, if we got a Hollywood voice cast, we could really make this win an award. And I'm like, I don't care about winning an award. Also, that Hollywood voice cast will cost so much money. That's both of our money that's going on the table.
Yep.
If anything, it's more your money. And so, yeah, I look at the value sets I can see in people's actions and processes, and you will see when you start coming at the world through that perspective, you realize how often, not just development, not just publishing, but like increasingly it seems every entertainment ecosystem is built on hyper contradictory structures that often defeat even their biggest successes.
Can you explain that really quick? What do you mean by they're hyper contradictory?
So as an example, I think that, let's just use games because it's the easiest and we're already there. If you have if your entire perspective is that live service games are the best type of game to make, and then you recruit a bunch of studios to make live service games, and actually this is a perfect example. So we live in a live service age, right? What I mean by hyper contradictory is you have a live service game, and that live service game requires new things for users, ideally every day, but like weekly, monthly, every 3 months for a season pass or whatever. You have a very defined cadence of things you need to produce to be an effective live service game. And if you release a live service game, as has happened several times in recent years, I think one of the most prominent examples is Marvel's Avengers, which is a game I loved. It had so much cool stuff in it, and there was such a talented team who made Marvel's Avengers. But Marvel's Avengers was a like AAA, photorealistic, multi-platform, live service RPG title that also any new piece of content took months, if not years, to produce. That's a hyper contradictory structure. If on one hand, the thing that your thing needs is stuff made today to keep people's interest and to keep player numbers high. And your structure says to add a new character to this game or to add a new voice line, it needs to be localized into 16 languages and it will take 3 months. You can't match the cadence of Fortnite. And that is what every industry is doing. And only the people who have like a high enough scale, like a Call of Duty, actually get to succeed in that environment. And even they struggle.
Is it that indies get bloated?
I think indies get bloated. I think, again, as an industry, we just don't have a way for talking about scope and talking about and evaluating a project that helps us to really know its full scope and calculate out what's cost and what's impact on team is going to be. I think for one of the most contradictory things for indies, if we're going to talk about how does the hyper contradictory stuff hit indie developers, is honestly the risk attached. Even compared to what AA companies would put into a PS2 game, the risk on an indie is so exponential, which means that, especially if you have a publisher, which is one of the few ways you can manage to get a game off the ground, then your publisher is encouraged to invest as much as possible into the game to make it to quote unquote make it a success. So instead of shipping just on PC, you ship on PC, Switch, Xbox, and PS4. That means your dev timeline has increased exponentially. And to justify that, you add another 2 hours of content because, man, it needs to be big enough to justify all this cost. And then you enter a waiting period. Maybe your publisher is talking to Game Pass. And so you're like, okay, I'll spend more time making more game because I need this to work. And the publisher needs it to work. So they're like, hey, I just heard that this cool thing getting made called the Ouya 2. We're going to bring this to the Ouya 2 and be first through the door. Because it has to be big enough to not fail. And so everyone in the room for an indie game is, despite the fact that indie games are really sincere, exciting, and exponential investment opportunities when it goes well, and potentially small losers, quote unquote, when it doesn't go well. Everyone in the room, and especially across the last 3 to 4 years, is attempting to make the games big enough to not fail, which contradicts their efficient and reasonable risk mitigated nature. Suddenly, you do have people pulling out of the indie space or cutting projects or cutting budgets for projects because they have created a cyclical environment, an ecosystem, a machine that says, well, every game needs to be big enough to not fail. But what that just means is you've created a bunch of larger bombs that can explode in your face. And also because it keeps getting bigger and bigger. Sorry. But like the maddening part about it for me is when I talk to people about this, either one, they acknowledge it, which is the most disturbing of all, or two, they don't see it at all. But it's like, okay, you put more money and more time into the game, it's riskier. And they're like, yes. And so if you put less time and money into a game, it's less risky. Yes. So can you make a game for a smaller budget? No, that won't be commercially viable. It's like Vampire Survivors and Balatro is right there. Not everything will be that. Those are huge outliers, but still, the degree to which it has been terrifying. Yeah.
It's this addiction to, okay, if my last game did well, or a publisher, they go, wow, we really did good with this first-person shooter or this roguelite. Let's go ahead and go all in with the next one. And the idea is, well, let's not just do a low-budget game because we're missing so much money on the table. So let's just keep pumping up the budget and the time put into this game because maybe it'll blow up like the other one did.
It is a highly cyclical thing, and it ends up being almost a game of chicken between a developer and a publisher. that they're not just doing against each other, but also they're doing towards a cliff at the same time together. And it's like, okay, well, if we get another 3 months, we can really polish this up. And it's like, oh, well, we've already put 300 grand in. I heard about a game. Its budget went from 1 million to 6 million. And that was just like
I hear this so many times, dude.
After another extension, and then publishers being like, "Well, we got to cut this off." But rather than changing their cycle of how they fund and run and produce the games that they work with, they just like cut off a bunch of their arms, and then those remaining arms are still part of a system they've created that will make it heavily. That will make it just a risk machine, a risk and gambling machine. And that's why I talk to a lot of people these days, and I say, if you're getting a publisher, what you're opting into and what you're looking at as far as like the horrible failures and the biggest successes of where game is at right now, the best of times and worst of times, is it's gambling. What you're seeing is people are gambling everywhere. Developers are gambling. Publishers are gambling. Gambling is an addiction. And that gambling addiction means that I was talking to a platform holder at one point. This was in the middle of 2023. It was one of the most necessary and beneficial conversations I ever had, but it was also one that like was literally stamping a nail through my heart at the same time. And they were like, here's the thing, Xalavier, you always make good games. We really love and see what you're doing. But when you come in through the door and say you'll make a game in 2 years, and someone else tells us that they'll make a game in 5 years, it looks like the 5-year game is more ambitious. It looks like the 5-year game is going to be of a higher quality and is aiming higher. And like
5 years though, good grief. You'd think that an investor would be like, we have no idea where the industry is going to be in 5 years, so we'd rather go with the 2-year project. That's what I would do.
Especially in indie, where we also know that 5-year project is going to become a 7-year project.
It almost certainly will, yeah.
But yeah, like if what you've got is an industry that looks at the numbers on the table and says, these are numbers that make sense, but that number may be the thing that changes indie games, what you get is a lot of people who, among other things, are scared. When I talk to a lot of publishers, a lot of publishing executives happen to be my friends, the number one thing I hear is fear, because they don't know how much something will cost, how much something will take to build, how much it will sell. And rather than change their machine or try to encourage developers to enter a more sustainable path, the only solution is to go all in, baby. You have to go in all in every time.
I don't think publishers just go away after 2024.
No.
It's not like they're just dead, right? And it's not like it's not like funding just stops being a thing, right?
I think publishers are still around. I think if a publisher even has one hit, they can live a disturbing half-life. They could just be a radioactive ghost, roaming the wasteland, still processing royalty checks for like the one game that did well, and not really signing anything else ever again. So it's not like publishers go away or the idea of funding goes away, but I do think what we are seeing right now, because it is not stepping back from the cliff, because it is not choosing not to gamble, is you'll see the best of times and the worst of times. You'll see publishers who one day they ask for, this literally actually happened to me at one point when I was really looking for funding. One day I talked to a publisher. They said, we only want games between 1 and 3, between 2 million and up. The next day they texted me personally and said, hey, if you've got a game that's $500,000 or less and will launch in 6 months, that's actually what we want. We are signing nothing that is in the millions. And I was like, okay, wow, big change. So what you're going to find as a developer is if you're pitching, you are not pitching to anything approaching solid ground. You are not a publisher. What a publisher says they want today may not be the thing that they want tomorrow. It will be gambling mindset or gambling adjacent, even if it doesn't start that way, because so many publishers are structured in the same way, they eventually get there. Yeah, I think that like that's why when people say to survive to 25, it's deeply erroneous. The 2025, we're still here. We're still seeing really contradictory practices, patterns, and self-destructive behaviors. So the one thing I think a developer can do to create safety for themselves right now is like literally calibrate around their own survival. That or enter the lottery with enough money to still survive.
Can you explain that practically?
I mean, I talk to a lot of students. I'll do guest lectures and interviews and so on. And one of the things I say is, well, if you have a game jam that does well, like don't spend the next 6 years on it. Your next game is going to be the best game you make, and the next game, and the next game, and the next game. So you finish it. You finish it and you move on. When you're pitching a game, yes, you'll run into trouble if you aren't at whatever is the arbitrary scale a publisher decides is the only thing that will make money right now. But when you run into that situation, like you go in with the game that you can survive either making or pitching and put no more into it. People are like, oh, okay, but what if I put like just another like week into my pitch deck and I make it like really interactive and has cool transitions? It's like, no, you're a father of two. Make the pitch deck in a week. Put together, if you can't afford to put together a demo, don't put together a demo. And make the situation you survive. If you've got a friend who never picks up their phone, if they have never responded to a text in less than 72 hours, don't start an indie studio with them. Like I'm recommending high practicality to approach a world of nonsense.
I see. I wonder what it is about game developers, indie game developers, and also publishers where they feel like they don't have to do standard business practices like every other industry. Well, restaurants in particular. Restaurants are really difficult to start and be profitable. So what you should do is, I don't know, find make a chain that you know is proven, right? So, or at least start small, start catering to your friends because they really love your food. And I think I've talked about this in a previous podcast where it's like, if you've got that small prototype that works, you make really, really good beef stew and you can cater it to your friends and then just scale and scale and scale. You can do it slowly over time until you actually have enough money to start paying rent for a place and an actual restaurant, an actual building. But with indie games, it's like that mentality isn't there. The mentality is, I'm just going to go all in for 3 years and hopefully it makes its money back. I think I learned that I was doing this all wrong. I think I learned it from Jonas Tyrell. I don't know if you know who he is, but he made a game called Thronefall. He works with a lot of the Grizzly game guys, and they have a very practical way of making indie games. It's like they do like 5 to 10 prototypes, and then whichever one performed the best, just on purely on the loop or like a simple mechanic, then they pick that one and then they move forward. It's like this sort of scientific method approach.
That's also what Free Lives does over in South Africa. People are like, man, Free Lives doesn't miss. And it's like they do dozens and dozens of game jams a year. Yeah. And only when a project gets massively validated and they know exactly how they ship that game. Like they also, even if a game jam does great, they don't start production on the full game until they know the road, like what the scope will be and how to finish it. And then they release that game. And surprise, it does well for them basically every single time. Yeah. But it is, as you said, it's very reasonable. And weirdly enough, when you try to do reasonable things in games, you sound like the crazy one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's something like my dad was and I have a question to you about your business model, but really quick, my dad was a CPA when I was growing up, and he started his own CPA practice. And the way he did it was he started in the smallest basement. The rent was like nothing, and he slowly made enough money and built and built and built. And then he built a building, and then he was running, he had a team in the building. And notice how he was making money while building the thing, right?
I mean, Supergiant is a great example where like They always did. They make big leaps, yes, but they didn't make Hades as their first game. And when I talk to an indie or to a student, especially someone who's starting, they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna make something like Hades." I'm like, Hades is the product of 10 years of making games.
Yes.
That's why
Yes.
that's how they have money to make Hades. But they have expertise to make Hades. That's how they understand
Right.
that what they have with Hades is even special and what's special about it, which is why they're able to make Hades 2 in early access such a success, where you see sometimes that sequel, especially in indie, statistically, we see that it does not do as well as the original.
Yep. And I just looked it up. It looks like their team is like 20 people. So it's, I don't know if that was the case during production initially with Hades.
It certainly wasn't the production on Bastion.
Right.
And
how big was that team? Let me see here.
I think it was something like 5. Like it was a much smaller team.
Yeah. But regardless, it says 7 people, but that's Google's AI. But you never know if it's correct. But 7 people, so that's a big team, for an indie. It's bigger than my teams have ever been. I just want to encourage everyone listening to treat your game like a normal business. It's like make that small minimum viable product and see if you can make money. See if you can make money off of a $2 game on itch.io. See if a prototype actually works, if people respond to it. Or it's as simple as posting a screenshot on Twitter and it's like, do people seem to like it? If they don't, then maybe you shouldn't go all in for 3 years. So my question to you is, do you approach game dev that way?
I mean, for me, one of the big things, and I'm very thankful for this in hindsight, was I always at every step of my game dev career asked myself what I needed out of this. So started as a games journalist. Then I went into game writing because I was like, this fulfills more of my soul. And then I went into narrative design because this fulfills more of me. I don't want to just be a writer. Then I was like, I don't care how good the story is. That involves the expertise of a lot of people, actually. What I care about is the game coming out. So I multi-classed into production and biz dev, ended up running a studio. And that's all, and this weird mix of skills I have and all the things I do now are a product of at every step intentionally saying, does this give me what I need? And is this sustainable? Can I keep doing this? And what I'd say at this stage for me, how I make games is I never want to start a game that I can't survive finishing. A big part of this is because when I started my studio, I'd worked on something like 40 games. And I would talk to friends who had made games that literally changed the industry. And they didn't look kindly upon those games because they're like, oh yeah, that game was great, but it didn't make enough money to recoup, so the team had to come apart. And I was like, man, if a game makes pizza money, I want to build the type of studio where that's still a victory. So we have games that have not performed as well as others, but I built a structure where no matter how well a project performed commercially, for the most part, we could still be happy we made that game. So the way I make, an Airport for Aliens Can Run My Dogs was made from the resources I had at that time. Space World Organ Training Simulator was in that same space. And as we've continued to make games, we made 15 games in 5 years. The phase I'm really excited about that we're starting this year is not just making the games that our resources allow for, but like just going full in on artificial constraints. That's where clickholding came from. I was like, what is an amount of money that as I'm making this joke with the Among Us developers at 3 a.m. is so laughable and small, it makes this joke worth making. And I was like, yeah, 20,000, 25,000. And so we made a game for 25,000. And if you make at every
that was
step,
clickholding?
That was clickholding. And if you, at every step, you're like, well, you have 3 weeks left to make this game. We will not choose a solution to any problem that makes it more than 3 weeks. Yeah. Turns out you can ship that game in 3 weeks, 2 months. We ended up having a 2-month dev cycle, but it ended up becoming more like a month and a half, 1 month because of some time we lost in the process of building the thing.
Yeah.
But like this is the brilliant potential of video games, and the maddening part is you can make a game in 3 days if you build the type of game you can make in 3 days.
I love that.
I
gotta write that
everyone
down.
to have the freedom as well as the personal precision as a craftsman to make that game in 3 days, 3 years, 3 months.
Yep. Oh man, dude. One of the most rewarding experiences of my life was when I stupidly I stupidly told PewDiePie I could make a game for him in 14 days. And I remember it was I live streamed the whole thing. And it was cool because I got like 100,000 subscribers from his audience because they came over to my channel. But I emailed him and told him I could do it in 14 days. And then once he said yes, I was like, oh, cool, PewDiePie said yes to me. And then I realized, oh, wait, I don't know if I don't think I can do that. What am I thinking? So I'm going to fall on my face publicly in front of his audience. And I remember I was working in my dad's basement at the time, and he came home from work. And I think I was 12 days in, and he was like, are you going to be okay? Like, he was like, I think you may have bit off more than you could chew. But what was crazy was I got it done. And it was great. And it was just this arbitrary, hey, let's do it in 14 days. And that's that, you know? Yeah. Whereas with my current game, Twisted Tower, there is no deadline. Or at least there wasn't. Now there is. But
yeah,
that's what creates this 3-year-long bloated mess, if I'm being completely honest. Whereas I wish I would have just said, no, this is going to be like a 2.5-hour long game. It's going to have pixel graphics, and we're going to make it for $100,000 and do it in a year. You know? So for you guys, how do you know what parameters to give yourself with production? Is it just based on your experience of, okay, I know these kind of games make this kind of money, therefore I need to spend this much time on the next one?
I think a lot of it is, at this point, personal knowledge. And this is another thing I really advocate for anyone, really, because we don't live in a culture that incentivizes or encourages it. I'd love to ask this question to you is like, do you know at this point what you need from a game for that game to make you happy that you made it? Is it the amount of money it makes? Is it the number of people? Like, what do you need from a game?
I think because I have 3 kids, it's money. I think that's probably the primary. And I don't know if I don't know if I'm ashamed to say it, but there is a little shame in saying that. But got 3 kids, you know, want them to get a good solid education. And so in my head, I'm like, please, God, I hope this game makes enough money so that we can live comfortably for the next 3 years while I make the next one.
So one of the big reasons I think it's also important to encourage people to make their first game small is, do you actually like making games? Is what you like making GIFs that get a bunch of likes on Twitter? Then yes, you can just make those GIFs. You don't have to. I've spoken to musicians, and they're like, I really want to make a Donkey Kong Country style soundtrack. So I spent 4 years making a 3D platform, and I was like, you could have just paid for a cool piece of art that looked like a fictional game and then built the world via a soundtrack. And so like, what I look for at Strange Scaffold is, what's the constraint that excites me? I was really excited at a game. For me, I know that being trapped in a room, for some people, this is heaven. Being trapped in a room with one game for 5 years, that is my magnum opus, would kill me. It would drive me crazy. What I love is an artificial, interesting constraint that means I can build a really quality game for an audience out the other side while matching it. I love hitting a deadline and hitting it well. And then moving on to the next thing. So I don't start 3-year projects anymore.
I got you. So to answer your question, now that I fully understand what your question is, that my answer isn't sufficient, because the truth is, well, Thomas, go be a lawyer, or Thomas, go be a salesman, or go get into real estate. You can make money there. That's not the best.
Step one is, you need to make games. And that's a really important thing that a lot of people don't know about themselves.
Well, right. And so what I found was, for me, it's like, I have this temptation to try and make the games that are popular right now.
Yeah.
I can't stand these games, though. The procedural generated, or the roguelike, or The crafting games, they're not for me. They're just not for me. I can't play them. I don't even know how to play them. I suck at playing them. I'd rather just play a really good atmospheric story game that it has a really strong voice. So to answer your question, if I can make a great, if I could build wealth for my family and tell stories in my games, that's it. That's the metric.
That also defines a lot of things. If like a publisher goes like, well, I'll take this game on, but you have to take out the story. You would never do that.
I know, but
this is why you're here.
I know. And I've had situations like that in the past with publishers.
Really?
They're like, we had these people test it and they really want it to include like more abilities and more skill trees. And I'm just like, I don't even know if I can do that as a developer. Like that's just not my skill set. My skill set is telling an emotional story and everything else is just a flourish. The story is the goal. And it's sad because you can sign a deal with a publisher and they know that that's your skill set and they sign you for that. They're like, great, we need a story game for our portfolio. But then as it takes a long time and 2 years later with new leadership or whatever, or let's say they get a new team, then suddenly they're like, actually, we want Doom 2016 instead of a story game, you know? And so they try and pigeonhole or like retrofit you, retroactively put you into that category when you signed for the initial thing. That's the big problem I found with publishers is that it's not the same person you had a relationship when you signed the deal. It changes because the leadership structure changes over time, especially lately. But you, go ahead. I was
going to say, to be honest, like that's also something that this is a little spicy, but this is also, I think, the root of so many indie horror stories about publishers that they came into a room and they said, this is the type of game we want to make. And the publisher said, well, we would like this version of the game you want to make. And the person hears that and goes, well, you got money, let's sign, and then tries to make the first thing.
Yep.
And it's kind of like when, if you've ever speed dated.
I haven't.
Well, if you've ever speed dated, one of the, like, a pretty cool question to ask is, do you want kids? Because that's just like a yes, no, and that defines so much of your life. And like, if someone across the table from you says no, and you want kids, or conversely, if they say yes and you don't want kids, that's one of the biggest red flags in the world is don't date that person for 3 years. And one of the big things that I hear indies do, and I see indies do all the time, is they tell me this awful story about their publisher, how they distorted their vision, how they didn't support them properly. And I was like, so like, what did the publisher tell you that they wanted? And they're like, they wanted a story light, roguelike procedural generation game. And I tried to make my really cool atmospheric story game. And I was like, stop right there. What are you talking about? Of course you had a problem with that relationship because you didn't want the same thing.
Yep. A lot of times it's just the publisher changed. The cool thing about Serenity Forge is his vision for that company, the CEO, from what I can see, his vision for that studio has always remained the same. In fact, I pitched to him Twisted Tower, and he was like, yeah, this is just not our style. They like artsy story games, and that is the vision. And they don't mess around with other visions. That's the one thing they do really, really well.
They pass on games that have made millions of dollars because it doesn't fit. And I respect the hell out of that.
I know, me too. And the reason I bring that up is because they're the kind of publisher that you're like, if you sign a deal with them and at least as long as you told them the correct vision when you pitched it, they'll let you pursue that vision because they're not going to change what they desire out of it. I worked on Neversong with them for, I think it was close to 3 years. And they just let me stick to that vision. Are you a publisher as well?
We tried publishing once. We're really glad about the game that came out the other end. But like, I found in the process, I actually, similarly for game development, I do this all the time for everything. I was like, I'm going to try publishing. because I want to see how it feels for me to be in that seat in the smallest position of risk possible. So I think it was a total investment of like $10,000
Uh-huh.
to be a publisher, plus like the time of me and other people who contributed to the game Purgatory Dungeoneer. And what I found was we really appreciated the process, and it was cool working with Damian Crawford, the developer of that game, Cannibal Interactive. The thing that came out the other end would not have existed without Strange Scaffold's participation, and I'm so cool at like that pairing of developer and publisher collaboration. But I hate being a publisher. A publisher is your job is total accountability with ideally maximal freedom for the other person. So you are accountable for everything that someone else does. And
It seems like completely opposite things. Like, how do you hold someone's hand and give them freedom at the same time, or make them feel free to be creative?
it's not just a rough balance, but like I am an auteur game developer, and that was a real eye-opening moment of like I'm glad I did it because I learned a lot. But so much of it was like me being like, I'm an auteur game developer. Why would I ever want to like? It would never make sense for me to come in on, say, someone who was making a 3-year game and kind of sit there gritting my teeth the entire time because that's not the way I want to make games, and yet I'm accountable for it. Mm-hmm. Like, I believe in having positions of transparency, accountability, and like reckoning, like really dealing with like, if I'm going to have final say, it's like servant leadership, right? That was something that my dad really impressed upon me when I was growing up was a leader. For the privilege of being a leader, you are also a servant. Your job is to serve. I believe in like for the privilege of the amount of power I have over the vision of the game, my job is to enable the people around me and to take it on the chin if it doesn't go well.
Right.
Taking it on the chin and not having power sucks. Don't want it. So I don't publish anymore. And and there's a real freedom in knowing what you don't want.
If I was a publisher, I'd be a control freak.
Yeah.
Because the horror stories of all the indie studios who just keep making the game and it never ends. And suddenly your budget's tripled, right? I've heard this so many times. But then I'm sitting here going, wait a second. Why is it that, I mean, I'm curious if you've seen this. Do publishers, is it your perception that publishers just throw money at stuff and then just almost plug their ears and close their eyes and shout and let the developers just do their thing? Have you perceived that?
I think it's more rare. I think a lot of times, there are ways of communication in particular falls through the gaps. So a publisher gets like radically surprised by ways that the game has changed. That was actually one of the most, I signed a deal with a publisher 2 months after their contract changed. And I was friends with a CEO, and he told me why that changed. And he said, every game contract, every publisher contract is a list of scars. All the times a publisher has been burned, every single clause is a record of that.
Yes.
So their publishing contract beforehand guaranteed this, amount of personal freedom for the developer to define the vision of game, the vision of the game. They had a game that, with that freedom, like 2 weeks before launch or something, radically changed the game that was testing well, huge amount of wish lists. That game comes out, very divisive, very buggy. And it wasn't 2 weeks beforehand. They changed that gosh dang contract so fast. Wow. And I managed to get in before then. And I think that's an illustration of a lot of ways that publishers change over time. It's not that they're plugging their ears, and it's not that they're hyper aware. If you see a publisher and you're like, man, they sure got their ear to the ground, that's a lot of that is coincidence. There's a very rare set of cases where that's just like prognosticators, a group of oracles guiding them to inevitable victory.
Yep.
The fascinating thing about publishers is like they're hyper aware of pain, kind of like a kid. You often will let them touch a burning iron because they'll never do it again, because pain is the only way they can fully process things.
Mm-hmm.
So this is part of why I also think like publishers can be to a degree dangerous for experimental work, is like, or just in general, I'm thinking as I'm talking and I'm realizing like publishers being beings that are hyper aware of pain suddenly helps you understand a lot about them. You suddenly, like when Star Wars Outlaws didn't perform as well, you saw like a lot of people in discussions around, do we have women on box covers? And that's because like it's a very binary thing where the publishing executives look and say, well, why'd this game do poorly? It's because there was a woman on the cover. There was a woman on the cover. And like those types of conversations are heavily prevalent. I've seen publishers where like they had a roguelite do badly, and they had like one or two, and they said never a roguelite again. And that type of
I see.
hard swerving, I think, is.
Yep.
I think that is an important tool for understanding publishers. Often you can see it through their failures, the things that they will be hyper aware of to unfair degrees. I've seen publishers pass on games that made millions because a game like it either failed in the wider market, or for them personally, which is usually as big or bigger, they're like, we just had a game with a comic book art style and it bombed so bad. Our investors aren't going to let us give $500K to this new game. It makes millions of dollars. But at that time, they aren't even in a position to fund it because like that's the fear that is most recent.
Your games are so, it sounds cliche, but they're like brave. They're like courageous.
Thank you.
Like the way you name your characters. I think one of your dog's names in that meme dog game was something Shakespeare, like Carl Shakespeare.
Chad Shakespeare.
Like, what that takes, there's a creative courage there to go, that's the name of the dog. And someone goes, well, why? Like you could imagine a publisher might reach out and say, well, we don't like the name of the dog. It doesn't make sense. And you're like, but that's what I want it to be, right? There's courage with your games. The courage in naming your games. Like a publisher might say, an airport for aliens. I have to look it down in my paper to say this name, by the way. An airport for aliens currently run by dogs. They might say that name's too long and it's not good for SEO.
Some of the funniest emails I've ever received were pitching that game around and having people like, especially like this is that was 5 years ago. So and they're just like trying to wrap their heads around like me being like, no, I'm making this stock photo dog game and it's going to make you cry. This is an important piece of art.
Yes.
Because there was one publisher that wanted to treat it as a meme game. And they were like, it's so funny. It's so effing funny. And I was like, oh, I can't work with you because I'm gonna take these dogs really seriously. Actually, that's gonna be the bit.
I kid you not. I thought the same thing when I was looking through your games, and I was like, at first glance, there's something of a meme quality to some of them, where it's like this is a joke, but then you actually play it, and they're so rich, and there's such a strong voice. Like you just know it's a strange Scaffold game. How do you have the courage to just put these bizarre ideas into your games? Like, do you not worry, like a publisher might? Do you not worry, this might not sell?
I mean, that's a big part of the thing as well. I know that I have very specific things I want to make with highly specific tastes and choices. If I make games efficiently, this has been my guiding star. If I make games efficiently, our studio motto is better, faster, cheaper, and healthier. If I make this game efficiently enough, I can make the name as long as I want. I can make that name as long as I want if I make it for $50K, if I make it in 6 months, if I make it in less than 2 years. And that has been in so many ways, not just a guiding light, but something that makes the game exist at all. I think there's a world where I'm still working on Dog Airport Game because Dog Airport Game got attention. It got nice articles beforehand. I saw the arc, the indie darling arc, like curve ahead of me. I was like, you can make this game for the next 5 years and be releasing gifts the entire time and building your magnum opus and build a box for yourself, just a total cage of nightmares where you get increasingly obsessed with whether or not this thing will sell. And why did I spend 6 years on a game called An Airport for Aliens Currently Run by Dogs? And so I just didn't do that. So even for El Paso Elsewhere, which is like probably still the largest in terms of scope game we've ever made, the idea of giving that game an endpoint, saying no game deserves 10 years of my time, because I'll never get that time back. I'd rather hang out with my wife. I'd rather read a book. I'd rather play a video game rather than make one.
Yeah, or make another one, right? This is so funny because your podcast is coming right after Ken Levine's. And he and I talked for half of the podcast. So literally this podcast, it is right after that one. The title of that podcast, at least currently, is how he spent 10 years on one game. Because he has spent 10 years on Judas, which is his next game.
Yeah.
And I was like, how are you not going crazy? And he's just like, meditation. He had to find something to stay sane. And it's quite literally shutting off your brain. Like that's how he's able to achieve it. And I know exactly, well, not exactly. I know similarly how he feels because I've been working on, my games always take at least 3 years.
Yep.
And I am so fascinated. I'm so fascinated by your approach because, to be completely honest with you, dude, it puts a lump in my throat. Like it makes me want to cry when you say that like efficiency is like so important to you. And the reason I want to cry is because I'm thinking about the future. I'm like, I there's this dream in my head of what would it look like if I get this game Twisted Tower freaking done? It's done. Okay, see you later.
Yeah.
And I have smaller games that are like 5-6 months long, and you just release them. They're like EPs for like a band or something. Is that difficult though when you have to think about when you think about the potential revenue? Like let's say El Paso, and by the way, El Paso is amazing. It clearly works. What would have happened had you made this thing your magnum opus? Would it be a $10 million game? You know, I can
actually tell you that was a potential path. I feel so blessed by the things that haven't happened. And that's kind of a weird statement, but like the number of things that haven't happened in my life, the number of things that didn't pay off. And at the time I was even angry about it. And then later it's like, oh dear Lord, I dodged a bullet. The year that we nearly closed as a studio, the only publishing offer of substance that I received was one that would have had El Paso like double or triple in scope. Like redo the art style, make it higher res, pump up the production value to make this a real like tent pole. And I think there's all sorts of reasons and ways, and if I was a different person, including ego, frankly, of just like, yeah, you know what? This is a game that deserves another $5 million. This is a game that can take that, that can take that. It will make the best game out of it, and that represents me.
Yep.
And the great machine I've built where I rap in the game and I star in it. It's all about me. Put more spotlights on me. I want this bald head to be shiny as hell. And I said no. And a year later, that publisher shuttered. So if I had made that deal to be the tentpole El Paso Elsewhere $5 million version, we wouldn't be making games anymore.
Let's talk about this whole is your game your baby mentality. Have you heard about this?
I have not.
Okay, so most game developers, they say my game is my baby. It's my baby. And I'm obsessed with it. And I nurture it and I care for it. And it's like, it's literally an extension of me. It's a duplicate of me. It sounds like that's not true for you.
Oh no. I mean, I guess it would be if like the purpose of you making babies was to make money. Like if you had a fourth,
There's a game idea.
If you said you have 3 kids, right?
Yeah.
If you had a 4th kid, specifically for the revenue it would generate, crawling on a little hamster wheel, then it makes sense. But like, we're making games, we're making commercial products, we're if you went to a master carpenter and they told you the price for making you a chair, and you're like, the price is fine, you're a master carpenter, I trust you with whatever you choose to do. They're like, okay. So, and you ask them, when will I have this miraculous chair? And the master carpenter said, between 3 weeks and 10 years. Also, the price of this chair may double. I don't know. You would think that person is a hack, because I think something we associate with craft is also precision, except in video games. And this isn't a call out post for anyone, but I think the fact that precision has been so undervalued in our medium, even culturally, the fact that we've taken the Shigeru Miyamoto quote, or the thing that's attributed to Shigeru Miyamoto, and said, a bad game is bad forever, a delayed game will be great. Like, the fact that we've hung that up and created a medium of craftsmen who have been trained to not have precision is criminal. A game makes sense to be your baby if it'll have the lifetime of a baby, but it won't. My baby doesn't get, if I have a baby, it's not going to be Steam reviewed. That baby is not supposed to provide me revenue for the past 5 years. That baby is a human life. So if we're making products, we should be able to do it on a time, on a budget, and that should be at a consistent quality for the sake of the people who are trusting us with their money that they get from their jobs to just go into something that will make them feel at the end of the day.
You're one of the, dude, I will tell you, I don't think I've talked to a single developer who said that. A lot of the developers I've talked to, I think almost all of them have said, yeah, it's my baby. And some of these developers, I'm not saying they're wrong, and they have kids even. But for me, that's my perspective as well. I'm also somebody who doesn't, I don't like the word legacy. Yeah. I'm not sure if you've ever thought about this. Like, people try and, artists, they're always like, I want to leave a legacy. And in my head, I'm like, yeah, that's not really what's going to make me. Well, okay, so as a Christian, I'm like, that's not what I think God cares about. Is Thomas an artist? And does his artistry shine forth after his death? I don't think that's what matters. Like, I think what matters is just like, loving people and showing God's love to other people. So when I think about my games, I'm like, that thing is going to be worth nothing in like 5 years, maybe 10. It's like, who cares? I don't even think about my previous games. I talk about them on YouTube because of the podcast, but like, I don't think about those games because I see them as ex-girlfriends, honestly. I don't know if that's the right way to think about it. I've definitely minimized the purity of games in my head. Like, I've talked to some developers who they see, it's like, it's so pure and it has to be perfect, and there can't be any motivation of monetary gain or commercial success. The marketing has to be pure.
And I get that, right? Like, when the art represents you and has to be, it isn't just a product. It isn't just a thing that people buy, but it has to be a personal extension. I get that. And sorry to interrupt, but just to like one up what you're saying, like, it is marvelous to hear that about, again, things that if we say go back 20 years, your I don't even remember which PlayStation it was at the time, but if like you're on the cusp of PS2 and PS3 and you've put all that time into a PS2 game, PS3 is coming in a year. No one's going to play your game after the PS3 comes out because it's not backwards compatible.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, I think we can't afford to have games be our babies. Or if we do that, everyone needs to come in eyes wide open about that, because what I'm thinking about is the player, honestly. And I think, from my perspective at least, I don't want to wait for a once in a generation moment in which I'm impacted to hit me every 5 years, and then for another 5 years I feel nothing. I play no game at all. No game is worth it. No game brings light and spark. I want more things expressed. I want more interesting little things that make my brain work in different ways. I respect the approach of the person who makes the game their baby, who is the total craftsman. It must be pure. But at least for my studio, I'd rather say more things. Clickholding wouldn't exist if I was still making Dog Airport game. El Paso Elsewhere, I Am Your Beast, which is our best performing game to date, I think, wouldn't exist if we went right into El Paso Elsewhere 2, because I need to continue the saga of James Savage, because he's me. It's me. I see it as an ego thing, and I want to set aside my ego to make more cooler things consistently with great people for the players who trust me with their attention.
What is your primary, and by the way, I know your time is valuable, so when you need to go, let me know. We'll wrap up here soon. But
yeah, I've got a hard out in like a couple of minutes.
Okay. One final question for you then, okay?
Okay.
What's your primary driver, your motivator for being an artist, being a director of games? I'll speak for me really quick. Mine.
Please.
There's two. So there's the bad one and the good one. Let's say it like that. The bad one is fear of being controlled by a boss.
Yeah.
So huge driver. The positive one is self-expression, like being able for the world to understand me, right? What about you? What drives you? What's the bad thing that drives you, and what's the good thing that drives you?
If I can ask one more question of you, because I've truthfully just been watching your work ever since Pinstripe. Pinstripe came out when I was still a journalist. I've been fascinated by your journey as a developer. I'm excited for Twisted Tower.
Thank you.
Like, when you talk about self-expression as a driver, is what you're expressing with each game different? Like, what does self-expression mean for you?
Oh, man. Well, it's so lame. Sometimes I feel like I'm an emo teenager in a 34-year-old's body. I don't ever feel understood in real life. In real life, I don't feel understood. When I'm in front of a camera, I could be expressive, and I can edit the video, and I can put cool logos and cool music.
You perform.
I perform. I could perform digitally, and people understand. When I create Twisted Tower, and it's about basically a kind of like a beta male who gets friend zoned, and then he proves his worth to this hot girl. That is this self-expression, maybe this feeling deep down when I was 16 years old, that's coming out now and being presented into a story of a game. That's why I love making story games, because I can say something and it can be clean, it can be understood. Whereas a lot of times in real life, I keep looking out my window because I'm just looking at the real world in my neighborhood. I don't feel understood. And so that for me is, it's just this feeling of, it's this desire to be like, to prove like I do have something to say. And maybe it's selfish of like, I do have something to say and I should have been listened to, and you should have listened to me, you know? And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but hopefully that answers your question.
It does. I think that's like, I really appreciate the, like, you viewing it in those two lights, as like self-expression is to a degree selfish, but also in the process of doing it, other people get seen. So it's really important for someone else to play this thing, and maybe they are 16 years old at this moment, being like, God, he sees me.
That's right.
It's really cool.
Right. Yeah.
It's always different for everyone, but I think yours is one of the most honest answers I've heard. Because if what you want is to be understood, games is you have so many different things you can noodle with.
I know.
To tell people a thing, how you feel. It's so cool. So yeah, I understand your games more now, which I like. That's me geeking out about that. Sorry.
What about you?
I'd say for me, my primary driver I think it's changed some, and I've been more and less honest with myself over the years. But if you ask me, like, for our next crop of games, we have 3 games coming out this year. I think I know what our next projects will be already. Once those start to spin down, we spin up our next ones because we develop things simultaneously, yada, yada, yada. The reason I'm making those games is because I love the work of having a vision, sharing it with the team, translating it into more of some of its parts, and releasing it. Like that entire cycle, that life cycle of a game from beginning to end, and getting that, loving releasing a game as opposed to working on a game. Working on a game, that's fine. Releasing a game, best feeling in the world.
Most people don't know the feeling, because they're always working on it.
Yeah. So like, I'd say at this point, like what I really want, and if I really was honest with myself about why I'm making these next games, I'm making them because I want to practice craft. I want to make this thing that says a thing. And I have this joyful glee because I know that I get to move on to say the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. There's one concept I had, which is so galaxy brained in its stupidity, that like the idea that that's not a 15-year away game, but maybe 2 or 3 with my development philosophy just actively excites me. So like I am at the point where I just love living, creating, and giving people around me permission to do the same. So if I, again, for contrast, if I got an offer to be like AAA creative director on like that Naughty Dog game that just got announced, Heretic, tomorrow, I don't need to be at the Game Awards stage. I don't need to make a game that makes $5 million. I need to release a game and thank the people who spend their time, their money with it. And then with like a wink in my eye, be like, hey, 6 months from now, I've got another thing.
So you're addicted to releasing games. That's you're like a drug addict for releasing games.
Oh, that's a blunt way of putting it, but I do think that's true. When people bring me in, I get brought in to also help launch games these days, or like someone will bring me in to like consult on their project or figure out what's the version of it that needs to release. And like, I do genuinely feel a rush when I'm like, okay, cut these 3 things. Really have the honest conversations between yourselves as a team about this thing, because none of you actually agree, even if you think you do. And here's the route forward. And like, we have that conversations. I worked with that team. And then suddenly there's a concrete release date. I literally get a full body feeling like, oh, that's good stuff. Oh, woo!
I'm really, really inspired by you, dude. And yeah, I appreciate your time, honestly. Is there anything else you wanted to leave the audience, or links in the description or anything like that?
No, look out for, I'd say thanks to everyone for listening. Thank you so much for having me. And the games that are coming out this year is we're making a beat 'em up tactics game with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tactical Takedown. We're making a co-op kaiju horror cooking game that we've not revealed the name of.
Nice.
And we're making a Match 3 Metroidvania, also known as a Metroidvania.
Whoa.
Creepy Redneck Dinosaur Mansion 3, which is a Match 3 survival horror comedy RPG Metroidvania.
And I'm gonna guess it's not actually the 3rd.
No, not at all.
You just
But the game is about that, though.
I'm sure there's some lore about what happened there. It's kind of like Troll 2. I don't know if you've ever seen Troll 2, but
no.
You got to watch Troll 2. Troll 2 is a horribly made movie, and it's not really a sequel to Troll 1. It's hilarious. Unless people can debate with me in the comments if that's actually true or not. But dude, thank you so much for your time. This was one of my favorite conversations, honestly. You're a really smart guy. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your time. Let's stay in touch.
Yeah,
Talk
dude.
soon.
Cheers.